All right, we are wrapping up the heart chapter, talking about how the heart actually develops. So this is the only slide I have for this section, but and this is going to be pretty quick. So the heart is going to be one of the first organs to develop, especially a functional organ. It starts beating and pumping blood around day 21 or 22, so about 3 weeks post-fertilization, and this is because we really need those nutrients and oxygen to get through the rest of the cells in that developing embryo and fetus, and so it's really important to kind of get this structure developed early, but that being said, this is not a heart in the traditional sense. This is a very, very primitive form of the heart, and so this is not going to sustain life outside of the womb and without that placenta and the umbilical cord and stuff like that to help out. All right, so the heart is going to start off with something called a heart bulge on the embryo, and so we are going to kind of start getting some of these cardiogenic cells and stuff like that in that embryo. So the heart is going to form from the mesoderm layer, and we are going to start developing into these tubes. And so around 20 days, we have these what are called endocardial tubes right here. And so deoxygenated blood is going to flow into them, and oxygenated blood is going to flow out. Again, this is still going to be connected into the umbilical cord and placenta and is receiving blood and nutrients and oxygen and stuff from that, and then it's coming into this heart, right? And so we are going to start these cardiogenic cords and endocardial tubes to start this very, 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 very primitive form of the heart. All right, and this is going to have this space in between them, and that's called a lumen, so an opening. And so we have these endocardial tubes, and they are going to kind of migrate closer together over a pretty short period of time and then fuse into this primitive heart tube. And so we can see those lumens in between them, those openings briefly. They're not there for very long. And the primitive heart tube is going to end up forming some distinct regions, and there are 5 distinct regions. So up here from the head side, we have the truncus arteriosus up here, the bulbus cordus, primitive ventricle, and primitive atria. And then we're going to also have the sinus venosus that we can see down here that develops just like a day or two later after the rest of them. All right. So this is our regions of the primitive heart tube. So these 5 regions here in this primitive tube are going to ultimately develop into recognizable structures in a fully formed heart, but for the time being, they stick in this rough position. So the truncus arteriosus up here eventually ends up dividing into 2 and gives rise to the aorta and pulmonary trunk. So that's where we're getting those vessels from that are coming out of the top of the heart. The bulbus cordus end up going to develop into the right ventricle, right? Ventricle, so it is going to come from up here and end up down towards the base of the heart. Okay, the primitive ventricle is right here. It is going to end up forming the left ventricle of the heart. And then the primitive atrium becomes the right and left atria and 2 auricles. And that's also going to combine with that sinus venosus to form the other half of the right atria, as well as the sinoatrial node and coronary sinus, which is one of the main vessels bringing blood back into the heart. So basically what happens once we form this tube and we have all these different regions, the heart, like I said in a previous video, the heart kind of starts to fold in on itself, and so this tube is going to kind of twist around and form in on itself. So we got that sinus venosus that's going to kind of flip up and form part of those atria, while the rest of this is going to kind of stay where it is, but end up at the bottom after this lower portion, the atrium and sinus venosus, end up flipping upwards to form those atria. And that truncus arteriosus stays right there. For the time being, we do have some of the branches off of the aorta that are starting to show here, but we are going to get that twisting of this tube in on itself. And this process, where we start this twisting, is going to occur between days 23 and 28. And the rest of the heart development is going to take pretty much the rest of fetal development. So once we've got this primitive tube formed and we are able to start pumping blood that is received through the umbilical cord out to the rest of the growing fetus's body, then the rest of the structures can slowly develop over time. And so you can see by the time we actually kind of have these rough looking chambers organized here, that's at day 35, quite a bit further into development. So the rest of cardiac development is going to be getting that septa, the interventricular septum in, as well as the valves. And then we actually need to make sure that the chambers of the heart, the 2 atria and 2 ventricles, are actually going to be in the structure that they need to be in. And so the septa between the atria and ventricles are usually going to be done by the end of about week 5. But there is still something called a fetal shunt, where blood is going to flow between the different atria, and that's going to stay there until birth or shortly after birth. And then the atrioventricular valves form between weeks 5 and 8. Semilunar valves form a little bit longer, take a little bit longer to form between weeks 5 and 9. And so you can kind of see down here this partitioning of the heart chambers. We start getting these septum to divide the chambers up from each other. So splitting between the right and left atria, and then splitting between the right and left ventricle down here. Week 8, we're starting to see those valves pop up, but we keep that opening, that foramen ovale right there. And that is helpful for the fetus, and also we are getting plenty of oxygen and nutrients through the umbilical cord, so it's not quite as important to shut that yet, but this does need to close shortly after birth at the latest, and if it does not, then we kind of go back into those congenital heart defects that we talked about in an earlier video. So heart does form pretty early on in development, but it is, again, not the heart in the way that we think of it. It does start off as this primitive tube with a lot of holes and openings and stuff in it, and so it is not going to function on its own without that support from the umbilical cord and placenta providing nutrients and oxygen and everything to this heart for it to actually function properly, and it still needs a significant amount of time for it to finish developing all of the different components that go into the heart structure. And we will pick up with blood vessels in our next video.